On today's show.
In today's episode, I'm going to tell you my biggest critique of Stephen King. Little am I to critique the man, the myth, the legend, Stephen King, but I'm going to tell you, I do have one issue with one of Stephen King's takeaways about writing. You'll find on today's episode what I think you should do different as a writer than maybe Stephen King says you need to do. One of the absolute best books out there about writing is On Writing by Stephen King. It's part memoir and part writing tool. It's an amazing book, but I will tell you, I have one big challenge with one of the most common takeaways from Stephen King's approach. And Stephen King says that to write a book, you need to write 500 words a day. And this isn't just his advice. Lots of other authors will tell you this one. But I'm going to tell you, most of us who are not professional writers can't necessarily do this one. I've got a job, I've got kids. Lots of writers struggle with this one. So people always ask me, like, how am I supposed to write a book if you can't write every day? On today's episode, we're going to hear from a master writer himself, Simon Sinek, who tells us his approach to writing, which is very different, in particular for us amateur writers out there, how you can find ways to write that works for you, even if you can't write every day. So, so we talked to lots of different people who are different writers along the way. And you are a gifted storyteller, gifted writer. Like, what is your style of how do you get words on the page? Are you like I get in flow and I do it, or other things? Like, what's your sort of like approach to kind of get words down?
I have a slow answer because because there's no simple answer. So I can answer it in different ways. So number one is, how do I write? And, there's authors will tell you, this is, some authors will say, treat it like a job, work from 9 to 5, work every day. Some will say, do it as a goal. Like write 2,500 words a day, whether it's good or bad, write 2,500 words a day. Well, I don't have the discipline to work from 9 to 5 every day. Yeah. And I don't like writing crap. And so I can't just get 2,500 words down just to hit the goal. And so, my writing style is best described as hours or days of hours of sheer brilliance. It's what it is. It's days and weeks of guilt and self-loathing, punctuated by hours of sheer brilliance. And the problem is I don't know when those hours are going to strike. Yeah. And so what ends up happening, my life, when I'm in book writing mode, it completely changes my lifestyle, because what I'll do is I will refuse to go out with friends for fear that one of those moments is going to strike while I'm out. And then I'll sit at home watching TV and be like, I should have gone out. And then I'll go out and one of those things will strike and I'll be like writing frantically on tablecloths and recording and anything I can do so I don't lose the thoughts. So it's a juggling act. So that sort of summarizes my cadence or lack thereof. But each book that I've written, I completely changed the way in which I wrote it. I found that what gets me into flow changed each time. So, this whole idea of writer's block, it becomes a very interesting thought, whether does writer's block exist, or are you attempting to use the old method, but you're a new person, So for example, when I wrote Start With Why, I had no TED Talk, no following, no nothing. I was just a guy with an idea that somebody took a risk on me and said, you should write a book. And so I scaled back my schedule because I was going to, write a book. I was one of the, I actually used my advance to actually pay my bills, because I scaled back my schedule. I wasn't working and my productivity plummeted and I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized that I needed the pressure. And I was actually very productive when I would travel, because I'd be on a plane and I'd have to get all of my work done before the plane landed or before my battery ran out. This is before they had plugs or Wi-Fi on every seat. And so what I would do is I used to fly to nowhere. So I called up the airline. I said, I used to fly to nowhere. I said, give me a flight that's super cheap. I have to be on the plane at least 3 hours. I don't care where I go. And put me on a day with light loads where my status will get me a free upgrade. And so I would pay like $200 or $300 for maybe less for a ticket. I flew to Phoenix and back. I think I flew to Orlando and back maybe. and I flew to Los Angeles and back all in the same day.
Really?
And I got super cheap tickets, and I'd get on the plane. I'd walk to the airport with a laptop under my arm, nothing else. And I'd get on the plane, open the laptop, and just start writing before the battery died. And those were my most productive writing days, were these flights to nowhere. And no distractions, no nothing. There was no, like I said, there was no Wi-Fi on the planes yet. And so I just worked. So when I had to write Leaders Eat Last, my second book, I was like, all right, start booking tickets.
Here we go.
I booked a flight, same thing, super cheap, flew to I don't care where. And I was sitting in the taxi on the way to the airport, and I had this horrible sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, because what I had neglected was that there was a lot of time that had passed from Start With Why to Leaders Eat Last. And I spent so much time on planes traveling around speaking about the book that I didn't, the thought of getting on another plane, it was horrible. And literally, I was in the taxi going to the airport and told the taxi driver, turn around, and I never got on my plane.
Really?
And so I had to find an entirely new way to write for the second book, which didn't work for the third book. So I had to find an entirely new way. So each book I've been open to reinventing what gets me into flow. Which sometimes takes a few weeks. And I think that helps. And I think, where writers get really stuck and beat themselves up and all this writer's block is they forget that who they are, the writer they are, the lifestyle they live for their second, third, fourth work, whatever you're up to, is going to be different than your first work.
Yep.
And so that means that the circumstances of how you write and how you find flow also have to change. So I've done that.
That's cool. We had Tim Urban came on and talked with the Wait But Why guy, and he was saying he's learned, he's been writing a lot of long form articles on the internet. The book is actually a method of experimentation. He had to experiment a lot of times because there's something about the book that was just a different sort of thing for him, which I think is, to your point, he's like, if you feel like you're doing it wrong, it means you're doing it right, because, you're sort of like trying to figure out where it goes. Yeah.
I mean, writing a book is very hard.
As you can see, even an author like Simon Sinek has to experiment to find ways to succeed. And it's not just Simon. In fact, most of the time, if writing is not your full-time job, your full-time profession, you're going to have to get creative about ways that you make writing work. Now, I'm going to share with you, there's actually 3 different styles of writers that I see that work on their book with me in these different styles. The most important thing in all of it is finding out what works for you. And we're going to describe this about finding your flow state. Flow is kind of when you're most natural, you're most energized. It doesn't feel like work, it works for you. And different people's brains work differently. In fact, what I find from working with a group of amateur writers is that about 20 to 25% of people write like Stephen King. And we call those habit writers. There are people who write on a schedule every day or pretty relentlessly in that way. Other writers on the nonfiction side include Dan Pink, find themselves as habit writers. Now, this is a lot easier if you control your own schedule or if all you do is write books. But I would say about 20 to 25% of amateur writers are pretty good at creating a daily or a weekly schedule that they're going to write within. The second batch of writers is actually my style. It's probably the biggest bulk of writers that I see, and we call those episodic or sporadic writers. Sometimes also I call them flow writers. The idea of these people is they find when the moment strikes them is that they will just write. And if someone is writing as a habit writer 500 to 2,000 words in these regular clips, flow writers, or sort of these episodic writers, if they hit, they may crank out 4,000 or 5,000 words in a single day. In fact, that's my normal style here is when I'm writing, I love to do a lot of writing. And in fact, when I hit flow state and I'm cranking a lot of words, I'll cancel other things so that I can keep working on my writing. Now, this oftentimes works when you start to figure out your rhythms too. If you are a morning writer, can you wind up blocking off bigger chunks of times to do it? Because ultimately, flow state does mean that you get into these 90-minute or 3-hour long chunks where you create. Or if you're an evening writer, can you make sure that you can get an extra pot of coffee and crank stuff out? So that's the second type of writer, episodic or sporadic. When they get struck with it, they keep going. And the big thing for sporadic or episodic writers is to do your best once you hit flow state to be able to cancel stuff so you can maintain flow state. The last chunk of writers oftentimes spill over a little bit with episodic writers, but they're more common than people may realize. And those are deadline writers. I would say probably a third of writers that I meet are really, really driven and motivated by deadlines. They need deadlines to keep them accountable. And so partially when you're that style of writer, it's important to set deadlines. Now, they don't have to be weekly deadlines, but usually something that's a month or more for a deadline. At the end of this month, I'm going to have this much, or at the end of these 6 weeks, I'll have this much word count or whatever it is, certainly work. The other important thing about being a deadline writer is having that external accountability, telling an editor or telling a friend that you're going to have those pieces. So it's not only being a deadline writer, but making sure you create pacts, we call them, these kind of informal agreements with other people about that deadline, particularly when you're not on some kind of external larger deadline, setting them along the way. And that's why having this collaboration works. So as you're figuring out your style here, certainly remember, it's an experiment. Some people work really, really well kind of on that habit writing. But if it doesn't work for you, it's not that you're a bad writer. Not everyone can be like Stephen King. If you're a flow writer, remember, understand your rhythms. And when you hit flow state, try to make sure you can maintain it. Because the worst thing that happens to flow writers is they get 30 minutes of flow and then they break and they can't get for flow for a couple more weeks again. So when you hit it, keep it. And lastly, for my habit writers out there, don't worry, or deadline writers out there, don't worry. It's not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing. You need to build in accountability around those deadlines so that then when they're coming up, you can crank off time and make them happen. Big thing with all of these writing styles, in particular, if you're trying to make sure you hold yourself accountable, is don't do it alone. Find other people to collaborate with. Again, maybe that's doing habit writing on a schedule with other people in a writing group. Maybe that's finding those ways to really tell other people and celebrate when you hit a flow state writing or a sporadic episodic writing, and to use those deadlines to help you. But the key thing to remember is that writing is not a solo venture. You need other people to help you hold you accountable and to help you pull off that epic writing. So, sorry, Stephen King, not all of us are like you, and that's totally cool. In fact, I tried it. I was a total failure in writing with the habit. I lasted about 3 days. I'm an episodic writer. I write with flow. That's my thing. What kind of writer are you? All right, everyone get your thumbs up here, and I'm going to scroll through. So we got multiple screens here. Oh, look at that. Like really thumbs up. All right.